Hello, everybody. My name is Martin Loffers. I'm the editor-in-chief of Supply Chain Movement, and I'm also the chief trend watcher of Supply Chain Media. I will be the moderator of this live webinar. We're going to discuss the survey results of a big survey we have recently finished about decentralization and decarbonization. So hold on and watch this live webinar. And we have two excellent experts. So next to me on the left, that's me. You've seen me already several times. And in the middle, we have Patrick Haaks. He's a managing partner of Buck Consultant International, or also known as BCI Global worldwide. Patrick, good afternoon.
Hi there, Martijn. Happy to be on a call here with everybody today. Looking forward to it.
And next to Patrick, we have René Buck. He's CEO of Buck Consultant International, or also known in the US as BCI Global. Hello, René. Welcome to be here.
Thank you very much. Good to be here this afternoon, this morning for our US audience.
Yes, it is. All right. So welcome, everybody. A few notes. This webinar will be recorded and will be made available on YouTube within 48 hours. This presentation will also be available as PDF. So, don't ask for that. The whole audience is on mute, but there are two ways to interact. So there's a chat function on the right-hand side, and everybody can see it, and everybody can answer. Probably the first question would be, is it recorded? Yes. And another function is the Q&A. You have the text bubbles, the Q&A. That's the questions we will track. And, if it's really urgent and in line of the discussion, we'll ask this question right away, or we'll reserve these questions later on at the Q&A at the end of this webinar. So, ask these questions. There's a lot to be asked. I think, great results and a great and interesting survey. So, but also after the whole hour, we have 30 minutes after talk. So Patrick, René, and myself will be sitting down at table 1. And so in a normal real life seminar, you can come to us and have some further conversation. So please join us there. So, after the hour, there's also opportunity to have a direct conversation, either about the survey or other subjects on supply chain matters. All right. As of this point, we will put off the camera. Why? Because you can enlarge your screen and have a better view on the presentation. So that's why. And we will get back when we have the Q&A at the end. So I will start. So there are a lot of things happening in the world. And René and Patrick, you can also put off your camera if you want, but it's up to you. So what's happening in the world? So we all know COVID-19 happened almost 3 years ago, or more than 3 years ago. And you see lockdowns, shortages. You can see it all here. And bullwhips happening all around. And as the end, it's ending up in a recession. And well, more than a year ago, the war in the Ukraine started, also leading to all kinds of ripple effects. And as a third thing, as of next year, you have the CSRD happening in Europe, but also inflicting on the rest of the world. So, there will be some carbon regulation, etc., happening. So basically, these are the things we know in supply chain, and it has a lot of effects. And it has an effect on decentralization or reshoring, as we're gonna talk about later this hour, and also on decarbonization. So basically, these are the ripple effects, and it's good to understand what's happening in the world and what are the reasons why. And the next thing is, what can you do about it as a manufacturing, wholesale, or retail company, or a logistics company? All right. But first, René, could you explain a bit more about your company, who is Buck Consultants or BCI Global?
Yeah, more than happy to do so, Martijn. BCI is a company which is already nearly 4 decades active in supply chain design, network design, in manufacturing footprint optimization, in location advice. We do that all over the world. So the company grew from European to the US market. We are now with 4 offices in the US, including 2 in California, 1 in Silicon Valley, 1 in Southern California. But also we have our own teams and offices in Shanghai and Singapore. And we see ourselves as a global boutique, and we're actually very pleased with the fact that Forbes magazine made this year, for the second time, a kind of overview of which are the world's best management consulting companies, and we were pleased to be on that list as well. So that's an introduction of who we are. Let's go to the background of the survey, because I think that's important. Martijn already mentioned a number of trends and developments taking place. And if you try to summarize that, we see that companies follow, we call it the 5DE strategy. The first is decoupling China. You can read it every time. Companies just with the geopolitical tensions, whether it's with Taiwan, but think about earlier this week with the European Commission to investigate now the automotive imports into Europe from China. So we see that companies are puzzling how to cope with that. De-risking supply chains, which we saw already in COVID-19, also leading to higher inventory levels. We see companies de-single sourcing, just don't want to be dependent on one producer of components or sub-assembly anywhere in Vietnam or in China. So having more multiple sourcing, we know it's more expensive, companies know that, but it's also to reduce your risk. Then we have decentralizing production, which we will talk in more detail, and we will talk about decarbonization. So how to reduce your CO2 emission levels. And just on the right-hand side, you can see that the number of European firms which have intentions to leave China or partly leave China is growing. And that's actually what you can see every day and what we see also in our day-to-day practice. Now, in the survey we did, we investigated together with supply chain media. We did a lot of work to get as many as possible supply chain leaders to participate in a quite extensive survey. So we had nearly 150 vice presidents, senior vice presidents, senior directors, supply chain, manufacturing, operations, corporate development, focusing on that in a variety of industry. On the right-hand side, you can see that we asked them, what is your first and second market? So it's typically cross-Atlantic, you would say. A lot of companies which have Europe as their first market and then the US as their second market and the other way around. A lot of companies also try to distinguish themselves in the market with product leadership or with customer experience, customer intimacy, less with operational excellence, although we see that in the current market is an important element. And you see also split over the various categories of size of companies. So we thought a pretty good overview of what's of interesting companies who have a global footprint and what are they doing. Now, if you talk about decentralization, and it's also often called reshoring, but I will come back to that because we prefer decentralization. It's a little bit more neutral, and it's more companies going into a direction of region for region production. Now, we asked the companies, have you done that already? And you can see nearly 50% said, yes, we are doing that. Later on, I will tell you what these companies are doing. Is it a massive closure of hundreds of manufacturing plants in China or Asia? Answer is no. But you see that up to 20% of the production capacity out of Asia is brought back to North America or EMEA. Now, if you look to what are these companies then doing? Do they onshore, nearshore, etc.? And the next slide, this slide shows you that. And onshoring is, and you know there are a lot of terms on onshoring, but onshoring is you really go set up a new manufacturing plant in your major markets. Think about Germany, the UK, France, or the US itself. Nearshoring is more cost-effective alternatives near those major markets. In Europe, that would be Central and Eastern Europe and Turkey, for example. For the US market, would that be more Mexico? Or if, for example, in the medical industry, we see a lot of companies also looking to Costa Rica. And so what you can see here is that onshoring in Europe, that a lot of companies who executed the last 3 years, really these decentralization initiatives. So it was not on the agenda, it was not on the boardroom discussion, it was implemented. That a lot of them went to also to the markets themselves, the major markets, and I will come back to that. Why is that? Number of them more on nearshoring. If you look to North America, you see that the majority was more on the nearshoring market. And Mexico, as a great example, is being overflown with American companies who set up new manufacturing plants in Mexico. In Asia, it's pretty clear that companies favor Southeast Asia, think about Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, over the major mature markets. Now, what are the drivers behind that? What are the drivers for decentralization? And you see here a couple of important drivers to doing that. One is the proximity of major markets, because everybody knew that with COVID, but also with skyrocketing freight rates between Asia and Europe and Asia and the US about a year ago, that companies are looking into being closer to the market so that you can serve your customer better. Less resilience, more resilience, less vulnerability, given all these geopolitical tensions. And you see here also that the reduction of transportation costs is also an important element why companies are looking for that. If you, those are the three most important elements. Now, the interesting question is, companies did take those initiatives. Did that pay off? So are the benefits they wanted to achieve, are they really actually achieved? And this slide shows you whether that was the case. So if you ask companies, hey, you took that initiative to decentralize, you added production capacity, or you took it back from Asia to Central and Eastern Europe, or Mexico, or the US, or the UK, you can see here, yes, the majority of the companies said we had the results we expected, or even better if we talk about lead times, the same about being more resilient. On the total landed cost, you see a mixed picture. You see there 1 out of 4 companies say, well, you know, the results in terms of cost reductions we wanted to achieve was 3 out of 4, that was the case. But 1 out of 4 said, well, that was less successful than we hoped for. Now, the question is, what makes then decentralization a success? What is really the success, the factors which make the changes successful? And here you can see that there are 3 important elements. Finding a cost-effective production location, which is, let's say, the total cost of a production plant, so including land and including labor and equipment and incentives and economic benefits. Finding the right suppliers, which is for many companies really a headache. It's you can say, yeah, I close a plant and I set something up new in onshore or nearshore in my major markets. But then the question still is, how much have you de-risked if then still 80 or 90% is still coming from Asia? So finding the right suppliers in EMEA or in North America is an important element. And you can see here also that the proximity of already established own operations was an important element. And think about that. Why is onshoring for companies in Europe still until now also an important element? Because you can relatively quicker act. If you add some production lines to an existing plant already in Germany, then setting up a completely new plant with all the capex expenditures related to that in Romania, for example. So you see companies in the shift of production capacity to Europe also looking into, hey, can be added to our existing plant in Germany or France, then using new smart manufacturing technologies, which reduces the share of labor cost in that, so that you can still operate smoothly. And you see that companies who did it already took that as a step also because it's simply quicker. Now, there are reshoring examples, as you can see here on the slides. On the left-hand side, some examples in Europe, in the US, and take a look at that. But what I also want to emphasize is what you see on the bottom and on the upper right-hand side is what we call hidden reshoring. Hidden reshoring is that a company who has a great operating plant in Asia still decides, for geopolitical reasons, closer to the market, more resilience, to set up a new plant in Europe, for example. Now, that company will not announce, hey, we reshore. What they do is they keep their, say, 4 production lines in Asia, but the 2 lines they wanted to expand, add that, in this case, as an example, in Europe. And so in Europe, it will be seen as a new plant, but the procedure, the process, the decision process within a company was really, should we increase our production capacity in Asia or do we do that in Europe? And we are on a day-to-day basis heavily involved in these kind of discussions. And nearly no one of our clients want to be known as a company who closes facilities in China and puts them anywhere else in the world. So hidden reshoring is the process where new plants are being established in Europe or in North America, but not labeled as reshoring. And that's an important element. Now, we talk now about upstream, about manufacturing. What about the downstream process? And here you can see what we see happening. And interesting is that companies move a little bit away from the central distribution network, so having one European distribution center or one US distribution center covering the whole market, into combinations, central receivers, satellite hubs, or because they know that closer to the market, labor cost, less traffic, less CO2 emissions, less trouble with finding truck drivers, etc. So companies are moving a little bit away from that typical European distribution center. If I take the example of Europe, one European distribution center, a lot of companies had that in Belgium, the Netherlands, in North Rhine-Westphalia, in Germany, to a more mixed structure where they have a central receiver also with satellite hubs, for example, for Spain and Portugal or for Southern Europe. So that's certainly a trend, what we see happening within companies. Now, we notice in the beginning, half of the companies decentralized already. Will companies who have not decentralized do that in the next years? And the companies who have done it, will they do it more? Here you see the plans of those companies. And you still see this is on the agenda. This is not something like, hey, let's have a brainstorming session about it. If you ask these 150 companies, does your company have more plans to change the manufacturing footprint? The answer is, for more than half of them, yes. And that means also in a number of cases, finding new production facilities in the major markets in US and Europe. And if you look to the reasons, what are your main considerations for to reshore, you will see pretty much the same type of arguments. You see here again the proximity of the main customer markets. You see here value chain disruptions, reductions. So it's interesting that the reasons why company did it already and the reasons why companies consider it to do it are more or less the same. But decentralization, reshoring, is not something you do in a late afternoon. So we interviewed the companies and asked them, what are the main barriers for not considering nearshoring or onshoring? And then it's about operating cost, lack of scale. You know, typically the US is more expensive than China or Vietnam, and the same goes for the main European countries. So operating cost, and if we decentralize, can we still build economies of scale? So scale is also an important element. So the cost, the cost consideration is still an important reason for companies not doing that. They require an investment, certainly these days, where financing capital is quite expensive. And you see also that lack of supplier base. So it's cost, it's supplier base, it's getting the money from corporate to do it. Those are the main barriers for doing that.
René, you know, before you go ahead, you know, we did a similar survey 1.5 years ago, and in 2021, operating costs scored 31%. So you see an uptake, real uptake as cost, and it's all related to interest rate, etc. So 1.5 years ago, this barrier of cost was only 31%, and now it's up to 56%. So that's a major increase.
And I think it's if you work with companies on a day-to-day basis, if you take the uncertainty in the economy, let's say in nearly all surveys done among CEOs shows that, hey, what the next 12 months will happen is not sure. We have super high inflation rates, let's say in nearly all parts of the world. So cost that has increased is fair. And it's good that you mentioned that, Martijn, because it would be strange if it would be the other way around. So this confirms the day-to-day practice of companies, correct?
Yep.
Now, if companies will further decentralize and reshore, what are then the countries which are interesting. So if you want to serve the European market, which countries would you consider? And so we said, would you consider? And then you have 5 categories: very likely, dark green, likely, light green, neutral, unlikely, and very unlikely. And so from top to bottom, you see Poland, Czech Republic, Romania, Hungary coming back there. We see more than in the past also that Spain, Portugal, Turkey are also into the ballpark, into the search area of companies who look into that. But you see also Germany and the Benelux, probably also with the same arguments as, hey, then we are close in the markets. These are smart manufacturing technologies implemented. Perhaps we can add it to an already existing manufacturing operations. That adds up. So it shows that in these new decentralization initiatives, that Central and Eastern Europe are more favored than other parts in Europe. And for the US, you see the picture that Mexico and the US are more or less the same, which is, by the way, as the US is such a huge market, also with really different labor costs or production cost levels across the 50 states. But that Mexico is interesting for many companies. That's what you see now already, in the northern part of Mexico, cross-border with Texas and New Mexico and California. You see already there that industrial real estate costs are increasing very fast. We see labor cost increases very fast. We see electricity delivery problems. So it shows also that this nearshore alternative in Mexico is for nearly everybody who wants to optimize its manufacturing footprint an important area to consider. Now let's look into this manufacturing footprint optimization, this question on how do we perform, how do we really help to optimize our manufacturing footprint. And you see there on the right-hand side in pink, the relative simple question. The question is, hey guys, what products do we produce with what technology for what market where? That sounds pretty simple. And we have a proven 4-step process to help companies. Because if you are an American company, you have a large production capacity in China, and you want to consider where should we, if you want to change your manufacturing footprint, you could say, I can set up a new plant in Southeast Asia, or in Mexico, or in the US, or perhaps in part of the production in a local Central and Eastern European country. So manufacturing footprint starts with what is the production capacity we have right now? What is the anticipated production capacity we should like to have, depending on your product portfolio, on whether you want to outsource production or not. Then looking into what are various scenarios. So defining the scenarios, and defining the scenarios could be, in my example, a sec ago, Southeast Asia, Mexico, the US, or Central and Eastern Europe. And then look into, hey, what does that mean? And that's the third step. It's the assessment of that manufacturing footprint. It's the assessment of those various scenarios. And we will give you in a minute the kind of dimensions we use for that. And once you have assessed all these scenarios, and in some studies that goes up to 46 different types of scenarios, combinations of this product line at that location, could be current locations, could be new locations. You have then assessed all these scenarios, and then you choose the most optimal for the company, and that leads to transition programs. Here's where we have to close. At this location, we have to consolidate 2 plants in Texas. This is a facility in Germany we have to close. And that's, so 4 steps: current situation and demands, scenarios developing, and then assessing, and then at the end of the day, choosing for what you can do. And what the dimensions which we use to compare scenarios is obviously cost, and cost consists of OPEX, on annual operating costs, but also capital expenditures, the investments you have to make, also transaction costs, how much cost it to lay off people, for example, in a certain country, if that's in the favorite scenario. We look into customers. What does it do for your lead times? What does it do for flexibility, for scalability? What are the third factors to assess all these scenarios is conditions. maybe also from a risk point of view. And more also interesting, and we will talk about that later on, is about carbon. So this C4 model helps to give a balanced assessment of all the various scenarios. Yes, there is no company for which costs are not important, but it's not only about costs. It's also the impact for customers, the impact on your risk profile, and the impact on your CO2 footprint. Now, beyond those sole factors, the companies can have also strategic considerations. Strategic considerations like, hey, are there synergies with existing own operations? I mentioned that already in the beginning, that companies who decentralized quickly to the US or Europe chose also onshore options where they have already existing facilities. It's also dependencies between that network. Are there critical suppliers, also critical customers who want to do that? So beyond the 4C types of consideration, there are also links with current footprint, critical value chain factor, impact on sales and competitors. Does it make sense? If you can say made in the USA, is that an add-on for sales leverage, or does it better that for your product line? And timing. Timing is also an important element because sometimes you have large agreements, for example, on real estate, or not every scenario can be implemented quite well. So on top of the C4, you have to look into these 4 kind of considerations. And with that, we're going to go to the decarbonization part, because in the survey we focused a number of questions and discussed with these participating companies, decentralization, reshoring initiatives. But then also we took a closer look at decarbonization. And Patrick will take the floor to walk you through the results of that part of the research.
Yeah, wait, Rene, one thing, before we hand over to Patrick, and looking at this, last year McKinsey wrote an article about business ecosystem, and a month later Gartner picked it up and wrote about supply chain ecosystem. This, what you are describing here, this all the elements in your network is like mapping out your key stakeholders. I think that companies should visualize their ecosystems more extensively, not in a linear way, but also other key stakeholders, even competitors, but also governments, NGOs, etc. And I think that's related to this. So I think that the visualization of the ecosystem is important, not only for decentralization, but also on the decarbonization, and that's we're going to discuss now. So I think that's a nice bridge for this. So Patrick, tell me about the survey part about decarbonization.
Hey, thank you, Rene. Thank you, Martijn, and good morning, good afternoon to the audience here. Patrick speaking. I think, first of all, we asked the question to the audience, like, hey, what is driving the whole decarbonization movement? And, I think, if we would have asked this question perhaps 5 years ago, or if you would ask that perhaps 5 years in the future, of course, you get different answers. But I'm very pleased with almost that 90% is really answering like, hey, this is driven by purpose from a company, or it's company intention, or company objectives. We need to drive and put sustainability on the agenda. Of course, you have the whole greenwashing movement and the marketing movement on look, our company is green, but I trust on the sincereness of the people here. So quite a large group is really driven by the fact that the company has put stakes forward, objectives forward, and that the company is making steps forward to reduce the carbon footprint. If you look at the other 2 factors, I think not surprisingly is regulatory compliance, whether that's on local or on a national or even pan-national level, as well as customer requirements. If you ask me honestly, I would expect the compliance with the regulation, that's only now a little bit less than 50%. I think that's going to be increased if you look at the change of regulations that are upcoming. Of course, when you look at the top bar, the 88%, you have companies that have been on the front runners, whether that's a Unilever, or whether it's a Nike, or Patagonia, or Schneider. But it's nice to really see that this really topic has been become a hot topic in companies' strategic agenda. So let's go a little bit more into detail. When I was talking about not on greenwashing, but in terms of branding. Apple launched a video last week. I would really urge everybody just to have a look at it. One, because it's great marketing material, but it's also showing on the aspiration and the journey. And in this case, Apple put Mother Nature in front of the Apple CEO to say, hey, what have you really done? So it's not anymore about aspiration. Yes, aspiration is important in terms of having a dot on the horizon, but it's also kind of, articulating, what have we achieved and report back to not only, stakeholders internally, but also other stakeholders. So I would really like to ask everybody just to kind of pay, a video, and it really starts off with the fear of the Apple CEO on, hey, I need a report, and are we in good shape or bad shape? And when we tie this back on some of the reporting requirements that are coming up, I think it also kind of puts the urge forward on companies to make, steps forward. So let's also talk about the importance of looking into the carbon component when you look at your footprint. So we ask people, when you look at the potentially nearshoring, reshoring, the whole topic Renee touched upon, what are the key elements that are, important or critical, right? You see the elements listed here. So you can think about service levels, so proximity to market, fulfillment levels, what have you. It's landed costs, so all of the cost factors that Renee spoke about 10 minutes ago. The risk, that's vulnerability, currency risk, all type of risk factors. Cash, important these days also with the whole financing, the interest rate, and carbon. And if you look at this, almost 40% really kind of sees, carbon and the need to kind of really factor in carbon and the decarbonization as a important, very important factor, or even a critical factor in the equation. And if you would have asked us 5 years ago, 10 years ago, this will be a much lower number. So it is good to see that, albeit it's a little bit less critical than some of the other factors, it's really on top of people's mind. And we also see this in our daily consulting practice when we help companies to reconfigure their footprint, that this is not an optional, but people are really asking for, hey, what does it mean from a carbon point of view, and how do we balance the right levels of carbon, service level, cost, risk profile, in order to make the final recommendation to the board and to implement, and that you're not vulnerable to any changes.
Although carbon scored the lowest, the margins of the percentages and the differences are minor, I would say. So, when you look at the service level compared to carbon, the percentages are quite similar. So there's not to say, carbon scored the lowest or something.
No, that's correct, Martijn. So it's the only thing is that the criticality might be a little bit lower, but if you look at the different colors, critical, very important, and important, or even somewhat important, then this is really in the room of error. So it's really kind of getting attraction as a important factor to take into the strategic configuration, in the strategic consideration of your footprint strategy going forward.
Mm-hmm. So what are the regulations implying for all this?
Yeah, somebody was talking about, hey, I was expecting a higher degree for companies, being pushed or being felt to be pushed by regulations. For some of the folks in Europe, this might be common knowledge. For some of the US folks, it might be a little bit newer, but also vice versa on some of the US laws is, in Europe, the CRSD is going to be put in play, right? So the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And this also kind of, disconnects the aspirational with, where companies can say we create very nice sustainability reports, but there's not like an auditing aspect in there. So basically, it can be very much marketing driven towards like, hey, but there needs to be an obligation, and companies, and you see the time scale here, in 2025, companies, publicly listed companies need to be publishing on their 2024 results on their carbon emissions. It put also the reporting very strict on the table. And even if you look into the example on the right top, right bottom part, even in the US, the bill SB 253 is being passed, which basically is asking companies, demanding companies over $1 billion of revenue to report greenhouse gas emissions. So you see on both sides of the Atlantic, I would say in Europe it's more stringent, in the US it is at a lower pace, but depending on where you are in the US, the need for the governments to put in regulations to push corporate sustainability. And I think for me, there are three takeaways here. One is, this is not like a freebie anymore where you can report and nobody's going to check on you. So there's a reporting a requirement. It's good money for if you're an accountant these days, because accountants would like to do that, but they're not going to do that for free. So the auditing is kicking in. And this is important. This is not only about stuff that you control, or if you have a factory and you need energy or you're burning coal or whatever. It's not only on scope 1. This is also about scope 2. So if you have an electricity bill or other elements, but also on products or ingredients or components that you buy from suppliers, and even commuting traffic of people. So the whole scope 3. And this is really where I think the challenge lies for many of us in terms of how do you capture the scope 3, because typically 60, 70, 80% of the emissions are outside your own company's boundaries, and that's in the scope 3 element. So those are, I would say, changing the requirement will push the boundary forward on how do we look into regulation and reporting for the carbon emissions within the company. And then, of course, if you think about this, so you need to have reporting capabilities. Then the question is, what do we have that in place today? And we asked that to the companies, and I'm not sure if people, filled this out to their aspirational of where they are today. But I'm surprised to see, in a positive note, that 1/3 of the companies responded like, "Hey, we do carbon accounting. We do carbon accounting for scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So what you control directly, what you buy as services as well as components." So 1/3 would be compliant, for instance, already with the CRRSD directive, but that means also 2/3, simply is not ready for carbon accounting, and that means that there's homework to be done for those companies. If you then look into the whole discussion or this conversation we have with our clients on the accounting and reporting versus what can you get as general averages, it's important to understand the difference between what we call modeling versus accounting. And on the left hand side, it's very easy to look at what's an average CO2 emission factor for an ocean vessel, or for a truck, or for buying a commodity product on the market. But that's different than if you look at your value chain, your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, your energy invoices, your bill of material, your allocation of those kind of attributes. And we had the pleasure to work with various companies in various industries, and that's really kind of not so easy and not so transparent in terms of to really kind of make sure you have the proper attributes and the proper data mined in order to put this in place, and especially also to make sure that you can run this as a report on a regular basis. Yeah. So key difference between modeling and accounting. Modeling is relatively easy. Accounting requires a lot of governance and much more data feeds. We also asked companies, how often do you do this, right? So you have the group that believes, or they claim they are having the reporting in place. Those are the companies that you see on dark blue on the left. Companies that have certain tools and process in place where they can do that on the modeling approach, or more like estimates, and companies that simply don't know how often they're doing that. So 20% simply doesn't know how often they measure this. And then if you look at the companies that apply some averages, they're very much linked to on doing this on an annual basis, whereas on the dark blue boxes on the left-hand side, you see that seems to be much more spread out. So some companies even claim that they're doing this on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis. So that's a positive, because I was expecting that much more to be done on a quarterly or an annual basis than even on a monthly basis. But of course, you need to have the systems and the processes and the data to do that. So what kind of tools are companies using and applying to really measure this? Because measuring is key. There are ERP system providers that have, added on sustainability modules, whether that's the NVZ model of IBM or Microsoft Cloud for Sustainability and others, but that adoption is very low. There are separate individual tools, I'll come to that in a minute, which have some penetration. It's a very dynamic marketplace. And then you basically see that the bottom two, almost 70%, even don't know or are using various tools, whether that could even be Microsoft Excel or other kind of generic tools, just to kind of mine this. And think about this: if you have to kind of map out your entire value chain on scope 1, 2, and 3, and you go to actual emissions, this is not something you can do on a Saturday afternoon or on the backside of a napkin, right? So it requires quite some different data mining, data integrity, communication with your suppliers, and so forth and so forth. So some of the tools you see that really focus on carbon accounting, there's different tools linked to either the physical landscape or transportation logistics, like for instance, Big Mile. You have tools that are more providing carbon databases that kind of get you started. You have the Arvani of the world, the Greenly, the Sweep. It's quite a dynamic landscape, and it's also pretty much developing as we speak. But if you really want to do this, and you have to, you also need to look at what kind of tools are out there to support your kind of business. I spoke earlier about regulatory and environment and the corporate sustainability reporting directive, amongst others. But there's one element that's also kind of changing, I would say, the decarbonization discussion as well as the onshoring and nearshoring. And that's what we call the CBAM, which stands for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is part of the EU Green Deal. And that's really linked to, if you put it at face value, it's how do we avoid as a society, and in this case, the European Union and its member states, that, that you have, for instance, a manufacturing plant that produces steel or aluminium in a certain country, that plant is going to move to Vietnam, for instance, and that you avoid your reporting requirements or any of the emission factors or regulations. So you offshore basically your environmental issues to a different country, and that's what basically CBAM wants to prevent. That's only going to be, it's actually going to be implemented October 1st as a transition period. So it's very early and focusing on categories like cement, electricity, fertilizers, iron, steel, aluminium, and hydrogen. And what it basically does is, if you would import products or raw materials or semi-finished products in those categories, and you do that overseas and you want to import into Europe, you basically need to buy certificates and need to declare that. So it's basically going to be an added tax there, but also regulatory requirements in terms of to declare that, whereas you don't have to do that if you would source that locally. And of course, then the question is, how much of this is this CBAM potentially a game changer? One of our clients, Renee and I worked with last year, they built an iron steel factory in Vietnam. And if you then look at if they wanted to use that for supplying the European market, and if CBAM would come into play, the landed costs were going out of control and basically making the volume in that plant not any more attractive to supply the European market. We also asked, of course, as part of the survey, how does CBAM impact your supply chain, and what kind of homework have you already done to assess that? Some companies have really already looked into that, and where it's a limited impact. The majority has not done that yet. And if you look into the expectation for 2026, you really see that 40% expects a kind of impact on CBAM, but also quite a lot of companies have not done their homework on that front yet. So again, something to consider in terms of, hey, what does that mean, especially when you take into consideration that this CBAM mechanism will most likely be expanded to other commodities than just the 9 I talked about earlier. We also asked the participants, like, hey, I was giving you the lay of the land on the regulatory, some of the key aspects, but what are the impacts you can do as supply chain professionals to reduce the impact? And this is a long list, and I think this is great because it also shows that there are a lot of different elements that we all can push to drive this forward. But if you really hone down to the top ones, so the key one here, and that's why it's also nice that the survey we've done on decentralization and decarbonization really ties in, is the biggest impact the audience believes can be done is on the supply chain footprint, so on the nearshoring and the reshoring side. And if you tie that in, for instance, with number 4, the minimization of use of air transport, that's already a big chunk of where companies can make an impact. You can also think about how to reduce waste in the production process. to reuse materials, recycle or upcycle materials. So that's a key one. I think one that is good to do for many folks in manufacturing and R&D is how to eliminate carbon intense products, and what can you do from a design point of view to change that. Of course, that has some ripple effect in time, but those four really kind of the top four really can show where you can make already a significant part, and there's a lot of other factors that we can think of on where companies can make a step forward. To illustrate, what can be done on the footprint, I simplified a real-life case study for a medical company. And I'm going to show you here on the left the current situation where this company is basically sourcing out of the US and China, 80% by ocean vessel, 20% by air. And they also have a factory in Poland. They supply to a Central European distribution center in Germany, and then they supply with various modes of transport to hospitals. And we basically assess different kind of options, scenarios, ranging from keeping the sourcing base the same, so still utilizing China, the US, and Poland as the key sources, but then changing the downstream network. So instead of having one large facility in Germany, to have closer satellite locations close to the key markets. So in this case, in the UK, in Spain, in Italy, and in France. We also looked into what if you split that into, not having one single centralized distribution center anymore, but we do that in 4 regional distribution centers, but still keep the sourcing from US, China, and Europe the same. Versus what if you change really the sourcing and go onshore, in this case, producing in the region for the region, replenishing your centralized distribution center by truck, and then the last 2 scenarios basically applying a more downstream decentralized distribution network. And again, this is a simplification of the case, but I want to show you hey, what are the buttons that you can push and where potentially you can start really on, hey, where are the biggest impact that one can make? And if you look at the results, and this is a very busy and complex picture with so many bar charts, etc., but I'm going to make it relatively easy for the folks to understand. So on the left-hand side, you see the index number for the carbon emission. That's the first bar, the dollars in terms of the landed cost, and the end-to-end lead time. And the dark blue reflects the upstream portion. So that is everything from the factory to replenish into the regional market. Everything that relates in facility is highlighted light blue, and then we have the downstream that's more on the final mile, and if you would have more facilities close to the market. So what I'm trying to do here is show you some of the results on, hey, what really makes an impact if you had to go for your biggest bang for your buck, both on costs as well as on carbon. So you see on the left side, global sourcing, one central facility, the carbon has a certain index. You see the cost breakdown in the various buckets. If you look into the let's say the 2 graphs next to the first one, so the global sourcing with satellites and with an RDC put in place, you basically see that the carbon basically varies, but I would say it doesn't really change that much. The cost base also varies, but that's all in the same kind of room of error, and the lead time as well. So basically not much has changed, although what you do see is that some of the red and the facility aspects are changing. As if you go towards more RDCs, of course let's say your transportation cost goes down in the downstream. That's also why you see the red element going down. I think interesting if you look into the middle and the right hand side of this picture, if you would say, hey, we're going to change our sourcing parameter, and we're going to move away from China US sourcing with ocean and with air transportation to an in-region production for the region, you see immediately that from a carbon point of view, and I think the majority of you will not be surprised, is that the dominance of air freight really gets eliminated, right? So the carbon index drops from 100 to 60%. So this is a huge impact that one can make. On the cost side, of course, you also see certain differences, but the bottom line is in the 3 graphs on towards the right, the delta between the carbon does not change that much. It's more the nuance on, hey, where's the emphasis? But also from a cost or from a lead time point of view, it is less the case. So what really this means is that if you want to make a key impact on your upstream part, if you really want to make an impact on your carbon and you want to decarbonize your supply chain, you need to look at your upstream part. And again, we simplified this case. If you would add the various locations for manufacturing, etc., it would be too complex. But the upstream part is really pivotal to kind of start and measuring, and that's where companies can make a huge impact as such. Whereas on the cost side, so on the landed cost side, it's much more driven by proximity to market and how you set up your downstream distribution side. What it also shows you that the decentralization of both manufacturing and distribution has significant impact on the carbon emissions, the costs, and of course lead time. So it is a win-win if one would look into that. If we go to, I know we have quite some folks in the audience that have a transportation or logistics responsibility. And if you look into what can you do, I showed already a few minutes ago quite some topics and buttons people can push. There's also a kind of a checklist in there on what are things you can do on a tactical level to reduce your carbon. That's linked to some of the stuff on strategic level. So we talked about that, but we didn't go into the whole movement about green facilities with solar panels, with the various certificates that you have, all of the modern facilities that basically do qualify in that regards. But there's also a lot of elements where that's linked to the mode shift or using different kind of fuels, whether that's electricity or hydrogen or other kind of synthetic fuels for air freight or ocean freight or regular road haulage, or if you look at the DHL vans that are powered by electricity, you can think about what can you do on the asset pooling side or on the collaborative aspect on working together with companies both horizontally or vertically. There's a lot of different elements where companies can make an impact. Of course, they have different kind of value for you as a professional. And I would like to ask everybody here, so if people have questions or would like to understand more, hey, what's the value add of looking at option 1 or option 2, please send us a direct message and we can talk more offline on terms of, hey, what is the experience in terms of what can that do in terms of decarbonization. Decarbonization not easy. Yeah? So if you look into the challenges that organizations do feel on carbonization, I would say there's typically, you see a big list here, but you can categorize this in 3 different elements, I would say. I spoke earlier about the CSRD and the fact that you need to think about scope 3. So the lack of knowledge at your supplier side, because if you want to measure scope 3, you're going to be dependent on your supplier side, right? So no insight of scope 3 data, lack of knowledge of the supplier side, that's one key category that is not easy, or that's definitely a hurdle for companies to achieve this. Lack of standards, I would say it's also lack of knowledge of where to find the standards or which standards to use, and no time, money, or no resources. Those are basically the 3 categories of what the feedback is from the audience on, hey, why is it so difficult? If you look into our view on how to get started, because we can talk a lot, and some companies have been the front runners and perhaps have doing this for some time. All companies, especially on doing the right measurements and how can you make steps forward. We apply a 4-step approach, and I think it's not rocket science, but the key here is on how to make sure that you start in the right manner and focus on the key elements. And it's really about the measurement, right? You need to start measuring your value chain from A to Z, including your supplier base and getting the right data. And that's a big challenge for many companies, and there are different ways on getting that and also the start of that. And that's okay if you do a mix of modeling and accounting in one go. But really, you need to build a foundation in terms of, hey, do we know where our emissions are from a carbon or from a greenhouse gas emission point of view? What are the key drivers? And of course, you need to start with your top 80% of your suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no need to boil the ocean there, but it's really about how do you make sure you measure, then conduct what we call a materiality assessment on, hey, what do we want to accomplish? Who are our stakeholders? What can we do if you put a plan on the horizon, and how are we going to engage the employees, the stakeholders outside the company in terms of making steps forward and developing a game plan and executing on the game plan. One of our clients, and I think the power is also here linked to communication. there's a lot of different things you can do, but there's also similar to like the Apple movie, it's about showing the value of data, but also communicating with your stakeholders internally, whether that's, for instance, sales and marketing, on what have you accomplished, right? So I see companies out there that create dashboards to show their CO2 reduction, whether that's linked to the warehouse, but also in the end-to-end value chain, or even if you do order management, and that there is a certain criteria for folks to look into, can we use road freight or can we use air freight? It's about the communication on what does it mean in terms of the CO2 footprint and decision frameworks, and the visualization of what the impact is and what the company has achieved so far. Because we need to, at the end of the day, report back, and we need to have insights in those kind of data points. I know we covered a lot of ground, but I would like to kind of sum up, what the key takeaways from both the decentralization as well as the decarbonization. Renee already spoke about, quite some companies have already, over the past 3 years, restructured their supply chain, especially the upstream part, and they have not finalized that journey. And a significant part of those companies that have not worked on that production part yet are planning to do that in the next few years, with a significant focus on onshoring and reshoring of production. Interesting is that onshoring in Europe gets much more traction than the nearshoring in the US. Nearshoring Asia is trivial, but the nearshoring in the US is much more important than the nearshoring in Europe. What companies doing this, of course, for the various attributes: the close proximity to the market, more agility and more resiliency, and reduction of costs. We spoke about the fact that it's not so easy to find the right supplier or the right production site and build that whole ecosystem to put in place. And from our own experience, we know that if you talk about one of the barriers being, lack of scale, especially if you are a high mix, low volume company, typically you have one factory across the globe. That's not an easy one to kind of crack the nut in terms of the decentralization movement. Central distribution networks will fade out or will be less favorable, both from a cost point of view as well as from a carbon point of view. If you look at from a decarbonization aspect, as I said earlier, I think quite some companies are seeing this as a key attribute in terms of importance, or even very important topic, also in the trade-off of changing or measuring their footprint. But I think there's homework to be done here, right? So especially if you look into the fact that quite some companies don't have their act together on the reporting on scope 1, 2, and 3. So that means that the next few years, people really need to set up the right process and systems to do that. And there's also ties into the impact of the CBAM mechanism, so the cross-border adjustment mechanism that the European Union is putting in place. Where can you make an impact? And there's various factors. So I would say, everybody can make an impact across the organization, but really the biggest impact can be found in the footprint, reduction of waste and recycle materials either in the production process or during the life cycle, change in the product design as well as in the freight. And I think the key hurdle that we need to overcome, and it might be good also for later on the discussion, is making sure that you have scope 3 data available within your supplier base and utilizing the right tools and processes to mine that data. Last but not least, before I hand it over to you, Martijn, is we have 2 deep dives, because this is a very extensive survey. This is one of a kind survey, I would say, to link both decentralization and decarbonization together. And on October 2nd and October 10th, there are 2 deep dive webinars scheduled with active panel participation from practitioners. So we have, in both of those sessions, we have people from the industry to share their own war stories. So I think that's going to be very interesting. So if people do have an interest, make sure you register as of tomorrow on those events.
Yeah. Patrick, Renee, thanks for your explanation of the survey results. As I can see, we have only 1 minute to go. The good news is we have 30 minutes after talk right after this. But I want to have one final question from my side, and hopefully I see some questions, especially from the chat, and we can pick it up in the after talk. But we have done two parts: decarbonization, decentralization. And my question to you, Renee and Patrick, we saw different kind of hurdles and barriers either for decarbonization and decentralization. What is your expectancy of the next years? Do you expect that these hurdles will be will be taken aside or will be combined? Do you see that these hurdles will stay for both decarbonization or decentralization, or will it help to resolve both sides?
I think there's actually the interlinkage between the two is becoming more and more clear. A couple of years ago, even when we did our previous survey together with you, Martijn, you saw that decentralization was a topic in itself. Now we see, and Patrick explained that if you have more region for region production, so a plan in Europe for the European market and one in the US for the North American market and so on, that you reduce the inter-regional transport flows, so from China to the US or to Europe, tremendously. And that has a substantial impact on the CO2 reduction. And as both are objectives, on the one hand, companies have the objective of making supply chains more resilient. And on the other hand, they have strategic objectives to reduce their CO2 emission levels. And by decentralizing, you can substantially reduce the CO2 emission levels together. So I would say a couple of years ago, it would be seen as two separate objectives the companies have. Now you can see that the two objectives can be reached together and they reinforce themselves.
Yeah. So getting back to the note of Patrick, there will be two deep dives later on about both topics, and we'll dig deeper. My question from my side is, 1/3 is already doing scope 1, 2, 3 carbon emission accounting, and my question would be what base and what frequency and what kind of tools you are using, and we'll get to that question later on in a deep dive because that's way too deep for now. So I want to wrap it up for now with the plenary session. So as I mentioned, right after this we have a 30 minutes or actually 28 minutes after talk in the lounge. So the three of us will be there, and you can sit on a chair in table 1, and we will join you and we have a further conversation. Next to this, we have just launched Supply Chain Media, just launched last week, SCM Wisdom, with a lot of articles since 2011, editorial articles, with all kind of surveys, own content, and with machine learning, and no commercial in it. So it's the kind of Netflix of supply chain articles, and you get your own profile. A lot of articles about network design, sustainability and circular supply chains, sales and operations planning, and way more. So that's been launched. It's only 10 euros per month for an individual, and you will be surprised what you can learn from that. And on the right-hand side, you see a link to a checklist we have created together with the BCI Global about how to do a footprint strategy with some good questions. So you will get this link and you can download it, and it's very worthwhile to go through the checklist, especially in this topic of footprint strategy. And as mentioned, there will be two deep dives later on, October the 2nd and October the 10th. And there will be supply chain practitioners into this deep dive, how they are dealing with both topics. So you can expect more content on that side. And as Supply Chain Media, together with BCI Global, we're going to create a management article also to summarize it. And hopefully the rest of the world also, the main newspapers in the US and the Europe will pick it up, because I think this survey we have done with a lot of COOs on major companies and CSEOs. So we have done a lot of homework to get the right people responding to the survey. So I think that's real cool stuff. So with this, I would like to thank the audience for watching, and maybe you want to join us right after this. And with this, I would like to thank Renee and Patrick for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
And it was great to do the survey, and also with the follow-up later on in October, we have some insights of the further results, and we have some questions very specific for myself, but also from the audience. So with this, I'd like to wrap up. Thank you for joining, and see you in the lounge. So basically, you sit down at table 1, and Renee and Patrick will be joining you. And if not, I will see you in another webinar Wednesday, or in the deep dives later on in October. Thanks for now, and goodbye, and see you later.